favorite beginnings to a novel is the beginning of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. What I'm about to read to you is just one sentence with a whole bunch of commas, but it is just a great way to start a story. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. What Dickens does in this opening sentence is try to hold things together that don't seem like they can both be true. It doesn't seem like it can be the best of times and the worst of times both at the same time. And as he unfolds this tension between these two ends of superlatives, as he calls them, he also looks back in time, right? This is a story about the past. And he says, this past period was very much like the present. And as you hear about these ends that are trying to be held together, does that not sound like the present we live in today? Right, this is what I love about old novels. They teach us that human beings have always been human beings. And when Dickens could look back in his time and say, today is like it used to be, we can look back to his time and say, yeah, we're still in kind of that same place. Now this idea of holding together the best and worst of times was set in a story that is set during the French Revolution. Revolutions really do kind of capture that best of times and worst of times. Because revolutions, whether they are violent or not, tear things down. They tear down institutions, they take apart the way things are, and something new is put in their place. And that new thing hopefully has more freedoms or more opportunities so that you have that best of times, but it's growing out of the destruction that may feel like the worst of times. So all of that in the beginning of this novel is kind of held together in tension. Now our gospel story today sounds like the best of times. You have Mary and Elizabeth coming together. And to understand how important this meeting is for the two of them, you have to know how they got there. Elizabeth was older in years and had been barren, unable to have children. And an angel from the Lord came to her and said, you are going to have a son. You're going to call him John, and he is going to prepare the way for the Lord. Does that sound like a pretty lofty expectation to be given? Yeah. Right. Then, Mary gets visited by an angel. And the message she gets is, you are going to have a son, and he's going to be called Jesus, and he's going to be the Savior. Does that sound like a pretty lofty task to have to take on? Right, so as Mary and Elizabeth come together, the only people that can probably understand what they're experiencing are one another. No one else would understand that they've been visited by an angel and been given this amazing task of bringing this son that each of them is supposed to bring into the world. So when they come together here in this visit, it is tender and it is beautiful and it is just this best of times kind of story. And Elizabeth kind of echoes all that out and talks about being blessed by the visit and that Mary is blessed for believing all of this stuff. But they know, I think they know, that it's not always going to be that way. Because the words that we read together as the psalm this morning are the very next verses. As soon as the part that we finish gets read, Mary sings what we call the Magnificat. And in the Magnificat, she says that the powerful and the wealthy will be brought down, and the poor and the lowly will be brought up. Does that sound like revolutionary talk? Right. So I think even in this tenderness, even this best of times moment, Mary and probably Elizabeth knew that once these sons got about doing what they were supposed to be doing, it would be revolutionary and would then lead to some of the worst of times getting tied into those best of times. Now, we go through the church here every year reasonably quickly, and we tell the whole story pretty fast. So tomorrow will be Christmas, and we'll talk about Jesus being born. And before long, it'll be boom, Easter. We'll have him hanging on a cross on Good Friday, talking about resurrection, and then it'll be next year this time we'll be doing it all over again. But the story didn't happen that fast, did it? They are meeting in their pregnancy here, and it is going to be 30 years before John the Baptist walks out of the wilderness to proclaim a baptism of repentance. 30 years before Jesus meets him in the river and gets baptized himself. And so this best of times moment they have has much yet to follow. Lots of diapers and, skinned knees and the things that moms do as their kids are growing up. And eventually then they'll get to the worst of times of the story. We don't know if Elizabeth is around when John walks out of the wilderness and becomes this popular figure. We don't know if she was there when Herod arrested him and had him executed. But we do know that he was executed, right? And so that best of times of this expectation of a child was cut too short by a king that felt threatened. Now Mary, we do know more. Mary had to go find Jesus when he didn't hang around with the caravan that was headed home when he was a kid. Mary had to elbow him at the wedding in Cana and say, fix it, turn water into wine, whatever you're going to do. But Mary also then saw the worst. She saw the arrest. She saw the crucifixion. And the best of times and the worst of times then had to kind of get held together in her heart, right? But then she experienced the resurrection, which is the best of times again. And so Mary has to live with all of that and hold that together. And for me, this has always seemed like an extraordinary story that may be a little bit hard for us to relate to, unless one of you has had an angel visit you and tell you you're going to bear an amazing child into the world that's going to change and transform everything. Maybe not. So I've always felt like this story's a little bit farther away, but for some reason this year when I was reading this story, it hit me that it really is much more of an everyday story than I thought it was. And the reason it hit me was because for some reason I began to think about my own grandmothers. Mary and Elizabeth are probably a little bit apart in years. My grandmothers were that way, mostly because my dad was the fourth of five, and he was older than my mom, who was the oldest of seven, right? And so there just ended up being some space. My dad's mom had 5 boys. The oldest one died when I was a little bitty kid from a heart attack at the age of 36. And I always kind of knew growing up that Grandma carried some grief for that. Because you knew she went and visited his grave at the National Cemetery in Minnesota, St. Paul a lot. One visit she shared a bunch of articles about him from his career in the Air Force. But I didn't know how deep it was until my dad died 20-something years later. My grandparents had to move out of their house they had lived in for 60 years. They were in town in a little apartment, and my uncle went to knock on the door later into the evening to share the news. And I think she knew that it was an unexpected visit. When she opened the door, all she said to him was, "Which one was it?" That tells you what she carried around with her, right? You're not supposed to outlive your kids. And having lost one, she must have just carried around this dread that it was going to happen again. And yet, I never really experienced my grandma to be this sort of angel of death, gloomy lady that was just waiting for that to happen. When my grandparents came to visit, they were always super engaged with us. And my uncles told me that she was always the one that showed up when someone died to bring food, and always was there with meals and help for other people. So somehow, amidst her own grief and the own dread that she maybe carried around, she found a way to still serve and live with a certain amount of joy in the world, right? And so she held those two things together. Now, my mom's mom, she had 7 kids. They lived on a farm. I think it's probably 60 years ago at this point. One of them was born, and he had Down syndrome. And that was, no doubt, a shock for them at first. And they told them, back then, my grandma said, they said, just put him in a home and forget about him. And my grandma said, that's not what we're going to do. And they brought him home, and my Uncle David was a great joy to our family. He could make everyone laugh so often. And eventually, when he got old enough, moved into a home with some other people, had a job his whole life, and lived a long and happy life. So there was that. And then when I was in 6th grade, we were there as I finished up 6th grade for my the 6th of the 7th graduation from high school. And there was a huge storm while we were there. And it wiped out all their crops that were coming up out of the ground. And it was just the last in a series of catastrophes. And they had to declare bankruptcy that summer, and they moved to Arizona. And they left behind number 7, my Aunt Peggy, to finish high school because she had gone to the same school, a little K through 12 small town school, her whole life. And she had a cold. Well, it turned out the cold was not a cold. It was kind of an effect of leukemia. And so they had to come back from Arizona, and that fall, and when I was in the beginning of 7th grade, she died at the age of 17. Now that's a terrible tragedy, right? Now, fast forward a few years, I go to visit my grandparents in Arizona, had never been there yet, and there, hanging next to the table, was a picture of my Aunt Peggy, and I hadn't seen a picture of her in a long time. And I was like a college kid and didn't think about these things, but my grandma was pretty blunt, so you could ask her pretty blunt questions. And I just said, Grandma, how often do you think about Peggy? And what do you suppose she said? Every day. And that was when I really began to understand, right, what it means to lose a child and then have to live in a way that's not supposed to work that way. And yet, I will tell you, my grandma had the best laugh. And you could get her laughing pretty easy. And when she laughed, if you got her going good enough, she'd snort. Like she could go and then that would make you laugh more, and then she would laugh more. And she just had this joy about her. And when my grandpa died too young, when he was having surgery for getting knees replaced, he had a heart attack. And so here she was all by herself, and yet she found ways to be connected. She found a couple of like 100-year-old women in her community whose families weren't nearby, and she did their grocery shopping and helped them with appointments. She almost lost a hand one Christmas, and lost a great deal of use of that hand for the rest of her life. That was right after she picked up a job waiting tables at 75, so she could earn a little extra money and go visit the grandkids. But then she decided to move back to Minnesota, and when she did that, she got married. She started playing golf. Her husband double-gripped clubs so she could hold on to them. And she just continued to live with this joy, even amidst the grief that she carried. And then my mom died. And my grandma was still there, and we stood around. Now, I've been a pastor for a while. I know how to plan a funeral and do all that, but when it's your own mom, it's different. We're just standing outside the church waiting for Grandma to get there to tell us what to do. Because that's what she did. She managed to always show up in those places and carry us along. Even with her own grief, she could carry the rest of us with her, and somehow she was able to hold together that joy and that grief and still be out in the world serving and being engaged. And so I had these 2 grandmas that both buried 2 of their own children and had a great deal of pain and struggle, but also a great deal of joy. And I never understood how they did that until this week when I read this story. Because in this story you have Mary and Elizabeth in this best of times beginning of the story. Have they given birth yet? No, right? We are 30 years away from the worst of things unfolding. They have done nothing to live into this promise that they have been given by these angels, right? They haven't done any work. They've carried these babies around, which is work, but they haven't done anything for anybody to necessarily say, look at all the saintly work you have done. And yet, when Mary walks into the house, Elizabeth looks at her and says, blessed are you, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why do I get to be the one to experience this? Which I think means she's saying, why do I get to be blessed? And then she ends it by saying, and blessed are you for believing what the angel said. Now, I understand blessed to mean that we have a share in the kingdom of God. When you read the Beatitudes, they say, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, right? There's this idea that blessing is having a share in God's kingdom. And so, to me, what Elizabeth is saying to Mary is, you have a share in God's kingdom. And so does this child you are carrying. And why do I get to also have a share in God's kingdom? And nothing has happened in the rest of the story yet, which means all that they are living with right now is a promise. They each have gotten a promise from an angel, and both of those promises are the same promise, which is that God is going to bring new life into the world. That's all they got. They don't have the children yet. They don't have all of what's going to unfold. They have a promise that God is going to bring life into the world. Is it easy to live with that promise in the best of times? Maybe. Is it easy to live with that promise in the worst of times? No, but that's all you got when it's the worst of times, is the promise that that's not the end of it. And as Mary goes through the rest of her story, and as Elizabeth went as far as she went, all they have is that promise, so that when those worst of times come, and they have to now live with the tension of the best of the times and the worst of the times, they have a promise that God is going to bring life into the world. When we get to Easter, we see that promise fulfilled. They didn't have the benefit of getting all the way to Easter just yet when we're in this story, but Mary does see that resurrection and that promise come alive. And what that means for us today is that as we try to hold together the best of times and the worst of times that are happening in our own lives and they're happening all around us, really all we've got is a promise. We've got a promise from God that the worst of times is not the end of it, that new life is what is always going to be coming into the world, that Jesus has already started that and will finish that work among us. Now, we don't always see that promise when it's the worst of times. It's just a promise, right? We don't always experience it. We have to trust that it's there, and that's where we get words like faith and hope. But I think the world deeply needs us to live in that promise. Because if we can hold that tension together of the best and the worst, like Mary and Elizabeth did, like my grandmas did, and no doubt people that have shaped your faith, when we do that, what we're really doing is living in the work that Jesus has already done in us. And when we go out into the world and hold those two things together, it's really Jesus holding us together as people and as a community of faith, so that all people might know God's grace, and all people might know this promise, that the promise may carry them through the way that it does us each and every day. Amen.